The German contract hit the glass table with a crack that made 20 executives jump. Victoria Harrington stood at the head of the boardroom on the 45th floor, her face tight with frustration. She glanced toward the corner, where a man in a gray uniform was emptying a trash bin. "Maybe we should ask the janitor," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Hey, you translate this? My salary's yours." Laughter filled the room. Daniel Martinez stopped mid-motion. He set down his mop, walked to the table, and met her eyes. "I accept," he said quietly. Every sound died. A night shift janitor had just accepted a challenge worth $2 billion. 2 hours earlier, Daniel Martinez had clocked in at 10 p.m., like he did every Wednesday night. The lobby of Harrington Tower was empty, except for the security guard who barely looked up from his phone. Daniel took the service elevator to the 45th floor, pushed his cleaning cart down the carpeted hallway, and began his rounds. He had worked this shift for 3 years. He knew which offices left their lights, on which executives threw half-eaten lunches in the trash, and which conference rooms smelled like expensive cologne and desperation. Tonight was different. The boardroom on the east side was still lit up at 11:30, voices bleeding through the heavy doors. Daniel could hear tension in the muffled shouts. He hesitated, then decided to come back later. But before he could turn his cart around, the door swung open. A woman in a sharp navy suit stepped out, her phone pressed to her ear. She didn't look at him. She never did. None of them did. Daniel moved down the hall and emptied trash bins in the smaller conference rooms. His mind drifted the way it always did during these hours. He thought about Lucas, asleep in their Brooklyn apartment, the inhaler on the nightstand, the medical bills stacked on the kitchen counter. $3,200 from last week's emergency room visit. The landlord's letter warning about late rent. The promise he had made to his wife before she died. Protect our son no matter what. He finished the West Wing and circled back toward the boardroom. The voices inside had gotten louder. He knocked twice, soft enough to be polite, loud enough to be heard. No one answered. He opened the door a crack and saw 20 people seated around a long glass table. Victoria Harrington stood at the head, her arms crossed, her face tight. She was 54, but looked younger under the cold overhead lights. Everyone knew who she was, the CEO who had turned a struggling investment firm into a Wall Street powerhouse, the woman who never smiled in photos and never lost a negotiation. Daniel stepped inside quietly and moved toward the trash bins in the corner. He kept his head down, his movements small, invisible. That was the trick to surviving in a room like this. Don't make eye contact. Don't interrupt. Don't remind them you exist. He had learned that lesson a long time ago. Victoria was on the phone again, her voice clipped and furious. "I don't care if it takes all night. Find someone who can translate 127 pages of legal German by 9 a.m. She listened for a moment, then slammed the phone onto the table. The sound made everyone flinch. "Unbelievable," she said more to herself than anyone else. "A $2.1 billion deal, and we can't find one competent translator in this entire city." A man in his 60s with silver hair and an expensive watch leaned back in his chair. James Caldwell, the CFO. Daniel had emptied his trash enough times to recognize him. "We should postpone," James said carefully. "Push the signing to next week. Give us time to review the contract properly." Victoria's eyes snapped toward him. "Postpone. Schneider Industries has been courting 3 other buyers. If we don't sign tomorrow morning, they'll walk." "Do you understand what that means, James? We lose the biggest acquisition in this company's history." A younger man across the table smirked. Michael Foster, the COO. Daniel knew him too. Foster always left his coffee cups on the desk, instead of throwing them away like he wanted someone to clean up after him. "Maybe we should have thought about that before we agreed to their timeline," Foster said. His tone was light, but the criticism was clear. "This is what happens when we rush." Victoria's jaw tightened. "Thank you for that incredibly helpful observation, Michael. A woman with dark hair pulled into a tight bun raised her hand slightly. Sarah Bennett, the general counsel. Daniel had seen her working late more than once. Files spread across her desk, her jacket draped over the chair. She looked tired tonight. Victoria, I have to agree with James. Signing a contract we haven't fully read is reckless. If there's something buried in those clauses, we could be opening ourselves up to serious liability. Victoria picked up the thick document in front of her. It was bound in black leather, the pages dense with small print. This is the final draft. Schneider's legal team sent it 3 hours ago. It's a standard merger agreement. We've seen a dozen versions already. Sarah shook her head. The previous versions were in English. This one is entirely in German. Classical legal German from what I can tell. That's not standard. That's a red flag. Victoria stared at the contract like it had personally betrayed her. She flipped through a few pages, her frustration mounting with every unfamiliar word. We've invested 18 months into this deal. 18 months of due diligence negotiations, board approvals. I'm not throwing that away because of a translation issue. Another voice spoke up quieter than the rest. Robert Williams, the Mergers and Acquisitions Director. He was younger than most of the people in the room, maybe 40, with the kind of calm demeanor that came from watching deals collapse at the last minute. I called 4 translation agencies. None of them can turn this around in 10 hours. The best offer I got was 48 hours, and that's if we pay triple the usual rate. Victoria closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, her gaze swept across the table, taking in each face, each doubt, each silent judgment. Then her eyes landed on Daniel. He was standing in the corner, a trash bag in one hand, trying not to breathe too loud. For a second, their eyes met. Then she looked away, and a bitter smile crossed her face. "Maybe we should ask the janitor," she said. The words came out sharp and mocking. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Michael Foster grinned. Victoria turned fully toward Daniel, now her voice rising. "Hey, you translate this. My salary's yours." Laughter rippled through the room. Not everyone joined in, but enough did. It was the kind of laughter that came from exhaustion and stress, the kind that needed a target. Daniel felt the heat crawl up his neck. He had been laughed at before. In grad school, when he told his professors he was dropping out. At the hospital, when he couldn't pay the full bill up front. At the unemployment office, when they asked why a man with his education was applying for a janitorial position. Michael Foster leaned back in his chair, still grinning. "Careful, Vicky. He might take you seriously." Victoria didn't respond. She was already looking back at the contract, her moment of cruelty spent. The laughter began to fade. People turned back to their phones, their laptops, their whispered side conversations. The meeting would drag on for another hour, maybe 2, and then they would go home to their apartments in Manhattan and their houses in Connecticut, and Daniel would finish mopping the floors. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way Victoria had looked at him. Not with hatred, but with dismissal, like he wasn't even worth acknowledging. Or maybe it was the memory of Lucas in the hospital bed last week, his small chest rising and falling too fast, the nurse saying they needed to run more tests. The bill had come to $3,200. Daniel's paycheck barely covered half of that. He thought about the letter from the landlord, the overdue notice from the electric company, the pharmacy calling to remind him Lucas's prescription was ready, but his insurance wouldn't cover the full cost. He thought about his wife's voice, weak and hoarse in those final days. "Protect our son, no matter what." Daniel set the trash bag down. The room had gone back to its low hum of frustration and argument. No one was looking at him anymore. He took a breath, stepped forward, and spoke. "I accept your offer, Mrs. Harrington." The room went silent so fast it felt like the air had been sucked out. Every head turned. Victoria's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. She stared at him like he had just materialized out of thin air. "What did you say?" Daniel kept his voice steady. I accept. I'll translate the contract. Michael Foster let out a short laugh. This is ridiculous. Security escort him out. But Sarah Bennett held up a hand. She was studying Daniel with a look that wasn't quite curiosity and wasn't quite pity. Wait, she said. Let him try. What do we have to lose? Victoria's eyes narrowed. She looked at Daniel for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether he was insane or just desperate. Finally, she reached for the contract and slid it across the table toward him. You have 10 minutes, she said coldly. One paragraph. Impress me. Daniel walked to the table. His hands were steady as he picked up the document. 127 pages. Small type. Legal terminology that most people would need a dictionary to parse. But Daniel had spent 5 years translating texts far older and far more obscure than this. Medieval German manuscripts, 12th century legal codes, poetry written in dialects that no longer existed. He flipped to the first page and began to read. The room watched him in silence. Some faces were skeptical, some were amused. A few looked vaguely uncomfortable, like they weren't sure whether to feel sorry for him or annoyed that he was wasting their time. James Caldwell whispered something to the man next to him. Michael Foster checked his watch. Daniel read for 3 minutes without looking up. Then he began to translate. His voice was clear and calm, the kind of voice that came from years of teaching seminars and presenting research. He didn't stumble over the unfamiliar terms. He explained them. He didn't just translate words. He translated meaning. Section 1, Clause 3, he said. The acquiring party herein referred to as Harrington Global agrees to assume full operational control of Schneider Industries, inclusive of all assets, liabilities, and outstanding obligations, effective upon the execution of this agreement. He kept going. The laughter had stopped. The whispers had stopped. Even Michael Foster had put his phone down. Victoria stood completely still, her arms crossed, her eyes locked on Daniel. Sarah Bennett leaned forward, listening carefully. James Caldwell's expression had shifted from skepticism to something close to shock. When the 10 minutes were up, Daniel stopped. He set the contract down and stepped back. No one spoke. Victoria looked at Sarah, then at James, then back at Daniel. Her voice was quieter now, almost cautious. Where did you learn to do that? Daniel met her eyes. Columbia University, Germanic linguistics. The silence stretched. Victoria's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. Confusion, suspicion, maybe even the smallest hint of respect. She picked up the contract again, flipping to a page near the middle. Keep going. Daniel pulled out the chair nearest to him and sat down. No one told him to. No one invited him. But no one stopped him either. He opened the contract to the page Victoria had indicated and began reading aloud. His voice was steady, professional, the voice of someone who had done this 1,000 times before in a very different life. Section 4, subsection B, he said. The transferor agrees to provide comprehensive documentation of all intellectual property assets, including but not limited to patents, trademarks, proprietary technologies, and trade secrets within 30 days of contract execution. Failure to disclose any material asset shall constitute a breach of fiduciary duty. He looked up. That's standard. It protects you if they try to hide anything valuable. Victoria's arms were still crossed, but she was listening. So was everyone else. Michael Foster had stopped smiling. James Caldwell leaned forward, his fingers steepled under his chin. Sarah Bennett was taking notes on her laptop, her expression focused and intent. Daniel continued. He moved through the contract, page by page, translating not just the words, but the implications. When he hit a clause about employee retention, he explained how German labor law would interact with American employment contracts. When he reached a section on environmental compliance, He clarified which EU regulations would still apply post-merger. The room had transformed from a boardroom into a classroom, and Daniel had become the teacher none of them knew they needed. 20 minutes in, he stopped. His finger was on a paragraph halfway down page 43. He read it twice, then a third time. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. He sat up straighter. Victoria noticed immediately. "What?" she asked. Her voice was sharp again, the brief truce over. Daniel looked up at her. "Section 7, Clause 12. We need to talk about this." Victoria walked around the table and stood behind him, reading over his shoulder. "What about it?" Daniel pointed to the text. "This isn't a standard merger clause. It's a liability trap." The room went completely still. Sarah Bennett stopped typing. James Caldwell set down his pen. Robert Williams, who had been scrolling through his phone, looked up. Michael Foster's expression shifted from skepticism to something closer to alarm. Victoria's voice was ice. "Explain." Daniel turned the contract so everyone could see. "This clause states that Harrington Global assumes full liability for all undisclosed debts and financial obligations of Schneider Industries. Not just the ones listed in the disclosure documents. All of them." Sarah stood up and moved to the table, her eyes scanning the paragraph Daniel was pointing to. Her face went pale. "He's right," she said quietly. "This clause is buried in the middle of a section about operational transfer protocols. Most people would skim right past it." Daniel wasn't finished. He flipped ahead several pages. Section 9, Clause 4. Intellectual property transfer. It looks like you're acquiring full ownership of Schneider's technology patents. But look at the subtext here. He tapped the page. This clause states that Schneider retains primary rights to all core proprietary technologies developed prior to January of this year. You're getting access, not ownership. Victoria grabbed the contract and read the section herself. Her jaw tightened. That's half their value. We're paying $2.1 billion for access to technology we'll never actually own. James Caldwell's voice was low and controlled, but Daniel could hear the anger underneath. "How much are we talking about if they have undisclosed debts? What's the exposure?" Daniel flipped back to Section 7 and read the surrounding text more carefully. "Based on the language here, if Schneider has hidden liabilities, you could be responsible for anything from $500 million to over $1 billion. Maybe more." The number hit the room like a physical blow. Michael Foster stood up so fast, his chair rolled backward. "That's insane. We've done due diligence. We've reviewed their financials." Sarah shook her head. "We reviewed what they showed us. If there are undisclosed debts, that means debts they deliberately hid. And according to this clause, we'd have no legal recourse. We'd just have to pay." Victoria set the contract down and walked to the window. Manhattan stretched out below her, a grid of lights and steel. She stood there for a long moment, her back to the room. When she turned around, her expression was carefully blank. "There's more, isn't there?" Daniel nodded. Section 11, Arbitration Clause. Any disputes arising from this agreement must be resolved through binding arbitration in Munich under German commercial law. Robert Williams let out a bitter laugh. "So if we try to sue them for fraud, we have to do it in Germany. On their terms, in their courts." Daniel met his eyes. "Exactly." Victoria walked back to the table. She looked at Daniel like she was seeing him for the first time. Not as the janitor who emptied her trash, not as the desperate man who had accepted an impossible challenge, but as someone who had just saved her company from catastrophe. "Who the hell are you?" she asked. The question hung in the air. Daniel could feel everyone's eyes on him. He had kept his past buried for 3 years. It was easier that way. Easier to be invisible. Easier not to explain why a man with a graduate degree from Columbia was mopping floors at midnight. But there was no hiding now. "My name is Daniel Martinez," he said. "I was a master's candidate in Germanic linguistics at Columbia. I specialized in legal and medieval German texts. I left the program when my wife got sick. The room was silent. Victoria's expression didn't soften, but something shifted in her eyes. Sarah Bennett leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. James Caldwell was watching Daniel with an expression that might have been respect. Daniel kept going. She had cancer. Stage 4. The treatment was expensive, and the insurance didn't cover everything. I needed a job with stable income and benefits. The PhD program didn't offer that. So I left. He didn't mention the hospital bills that had drained their savings. He didn't mention sitting in the oncology ward at 3 in the morning holding his wife's hand, while she slept, wondering how he was going to pay for another round of chemotherapy. He didn't mention the moment she died, or the way Lucas had cried for weeks afterward, or the nights Daniel had spent staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how to be both mother and father to an 8-year-old boy. I took the night shift here because it let me be home with my son during the day, Daniel said. He has asthma, chronic. He needs someone around in case he has an attack. Victoria's voice was quieter now. Why didn't you ever say anything? You've been here 3 years. You could have applied for a different position. Daniel met her eyes. Would you have listened? I'm the invisible man who empties your trash. That's all I've ever been to anyone in this building. The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. Sarah Bennett looked down at her laptop. James Caldwell adjusted his watch. Even Michael Foster seemed to have run out of things to say. Victoria picked up the contract again. If you're right about this, she said slowly, if this is really a trap, then we're about to make the worst decision in this company's history. Daniel nodded. You are. Michael Foster finally found his voice. How do we know you're not sabotaging us? Maybe you're being paid by a competitor. Maybe you're just making this up to get attention. Daniel turned to look at him. I have a son who needs me. I wouldn't risk my job on a lie. Sarah Bennett cleared her throat. We can verify this. I can run the contract through our AI translation system. It'll take a couple of hours, but it'll tell us if his translation is accurate. Victoria looked at Sarah, then at Daniel, then at the contract. Her decision was written on her face before she said the words. Do it. Sarah nodded and left the room, taking the contract with her. The minutes that followed felt like hours. No one left. No one spoke. Daniel sat at the table, his hands folded in front of him, while 20 executives waited in silence. Some of them checked their phones. Others stared at the table. Victoria stood by the window again, her silhouette sharp against the city lights. James Caldwell finally broke the silence. If he's right, we need to pull out of the deal. Victoria didn't turn around. If we pull out, we lose the $50 million deposit. Michael Foster shook his head. $50 million is nothing compared to $1 billion in hidden liabilities. Robert Williams spoke up. There's also the reputational damage. If word gets out that we almost signed a fraudulent contract, the board will have questions. Shareholders will have questions. Victoria turned around. And if we don't sign, Schneider will spin it as us backing out at the last minute. They'll say we're unreliable, that we can't close a deal. James met her eyes. I'd rather look unreliable than bankrupt. The debate went on circular and tense. Daniel listened, but didn't participate. This wasn't his fight anymore. He had done what he came to do. He had translated the contract. He had warned them. What they did with that information was up to them. At 1:45 in the morning, Sarah Bennett came back. She was carrying a laptop and a printed report. Her face was pale. She set the laptop on the table and turned the screen toward Victoria. He's right, she said quietly. Every single word. The room exhaled. Victoria stared at the screen, her expression unreadable. Sarah continued. I ran the full contract through 3 different AI translation programs. They all flagged the same sections Daniel identified. The liability clause, the intellectual property restrictions, the arbitration requirement. This contract is designed to look like a standard merger agreement, but it's actually a takeover. Schneider isn't selling their company. They're selling you their debts. James Caldwell's voice was steady but cold. Do we know how much debt we're talking about? Sarah pulled up another document on her laptop. I did some digging into Schneider's public filings in Germany. There are gaps, large gaps. Based on what I'm seeing, they could be hiding anywhere from $600 million to over $1 billion in liabilities. Michael Foster slammed his hand on the table. This is fraud. We should sue them into the ground. Sarah shook her head. We can't. Not under this contract. The arbitration clause makes it nearly impossible. Even if we won, it would take years and cost us millions in legal fees. Victoria sat down. For the first time all night, she looked tired. Not just physically tired, but the kind of tired that came from realizing you had been played. If we had signed that contract, she said slowly, we'd be facing bankruptcy within 18 months. James nodded. Maybe sooner. Victoria looked at Daniel. He was still sitting at the table, quiet and composed, like he had nowhere else to be. This man just saved the company, she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Sarah closed her laptop. He did. The weight of that realization settled over the room. Daniel had walked into this boardroom 2 hours ago as a janitor. Now he was the only reason Harrington Global still had a future. The silence stretched until Michael Foster broke it, his voice sharp and defensive. So what do we do now? Victoria stood up. We call Schneider and tell them the deal is off. James leaned forward. They'll want to know why. Victoria's expression hardened. I don't care what they want. We're not signing that contract. Robert Williams spoke carefully. They'll keep the deposit. Victoria met his eyes. $50 million is a small price to pay for not losing $1 billion. Sarah picked up her laptop. I'll draft the termination notice. We can send it first thing in the morning. Victoria nodded. Then she turned to Daniel. Mr. Martinez, I owe you an apology, and much more than that. Daniel stood up. He was exhausted. His shift had started 6 hours ago, and he still had floors to mop, trash to empty bathrooms to clean. But he met Victoria's eyes and waited. I'd like to offer you a position, Victoria said. Director of International Contracts and Translations. Salary of $180,000 per year, plus full health benefits for you and your family. The number hung in the air. $180,000. Daniel thought about Lucas's medical bills, the rent, the prescriptions, the future he had been trying to build one paycheck at a time. He thought about his wife's voice. Protect our son no matter what. I don't need your salary, Mrs. Harrington, Daniel said quietly. I need respect. Victoria didn't blink. You have it. Daniel looked around the room. Sarah Bennett was watching him with something close to admiration. James Caldwell nodded slightly. Even Michael Foster had stopped glaring. I'll take the job, Daniel said. For my son. Victoria held out her hand. Daniel shook it. Her grip was firm and steady. You start Monday, she said. 9 a.m. We'll get you set up with an office and a team. Daniel nodded. Then he walked to the corner of the room, picked up his mop and cleaning cart, and left. Behind him, the boardroom erupted into motion. Phones rang. Laptops opened. Voices overlapped as the executives scrambled to contain the damage and rewrite the future. But Daniel didn't stay to watch. He had work to finish. 6 more floors to clean before his shift ended at 6 in the morning. Victoria called an emergency board meeting for 3 in the morning. Daniel heard about it through the glass walls as he mopped the hallway outside the boardroom. Voices were raised. Phones were ringing. Someone mentioned lawyers. Someone else mentioned the press. He kept his head down and kept working. This was their crisis to manage now. He had done his part. By 4 a.m., the building felt different. Word had spread. Junior associates who normally wouldn't arrive until 8 were filing into conference rooms. The legal department was lit up like a Christmas tree. Daniel passed Sarah Bennett in the hallway. She was carrying 3 folders and a coffee that looked like it had gone cold an hour ago. She stopped when she saw him. "Thank you," she said quietly. Daniel nodded. He didn't know what else to say. Sarah looked like she wanted to add something, but her phone rang and she hurried away. Daniel finished the 45th floor and took the elevator down to 44. The night was almost over. In 2 hours, his shift would end. In 2 hours, he would go home to Brooklyn, wake Lucas up for school, make breakfast, and pretend that nothing had changed. But everything had changed. He knew that. He just didn't know what it meant yet. At 5:30, Daniel clocked out. The security guard at the front desk looked up from his phone long enough to nod. Daniel stepped out into the cold March morning. The streets were still dark, but the city was waking up. Delivery trucks rumbled past. A few early commuters hurried toward the subway. Daniel walked 3 blocks to the train station and rode the R line back to Brooklyn. Lucas was still asleep when Daniel got home. The apartment was small, just 2 bedrooms and a kitchen that barely fit a table. But it was clean, and it was theirs. Daniel made coffee and sat at the table staring at the stack of medical bills he hadn't had time to open. $3,200 from the emergency room, $800 from the follow-up appointment, $250 for prescriptions. The numbers blurred together. He thought about Victoria's offer, $180,000 a year, full health benefits, an office, a team. It felt surreal, like something that had happened to someone else. He pulled out his phone and looked at the message Sarah had sent him an hour ago. It was just an address and a time. Monday 9 a.m. 40th floor. Lucas woke up at 7. He shuffled into the kitchen in his pajamas, his hair sticking up in every direction. "Morning, Dad." Daniel smiled. "Morning, buddy. How'd you sleep?" Lucas shrugged and climbed into a chair. "Okay. I had a dream about dinosaurs." Daniel poured cereal into a bowl and set it in front of his son. Good dinosaurs, or scary dinosaurs. Lucas thought about it. Good ones. They were helping people. Daniel sat across from him and watched him eat. Lucas's inhaler was on the counter right where it always was, just in case. Daniel thought about the new insurance plan Victoria had mentioned. Full coverage. No more fighting with the pharmacy over copays. No more choosing between paying rent and paying for medication. "Dad," Lucas was looking at him with curious eyes. "Are you okay?" Daniel realized he had been staring. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired." Lucas nodded like that made sense. "You work too much." Daniel reached across the table and ruffled his hair. "Maybe. But that might change soon." Lucas looked up, hopeful. "Really?" Daniel didn't want to promise anything yet. Not until it was real. Not until he walked into that office on Monday and saw his name on the door. "We'll see," he said. The weekend passed in a blur. Daniel tried to sleep, but his mind wouldn't stop. He kept replaying the meeting. Victoria's face when she realized the contract was a trap. Sarah's voice when she confirmed his translation. The moment Michael Foster had tried to throw him out, and Sarah had stopped him. By Sunday night, Daniel had given up on sleep entirely. He sat on the couch and watched old movies until the sun came up. Monday morning arrived cold and clear. Daniel put on the only suit he owned. It was 10 years old, and didn't fit quite right anymore. But it was clean and pressed. Lucas watched him from the doorway, his eyes wide. "You look fancy," Lucas said. Daniel adjusted his tie in the mirror. "I have a meeting." Lucas tilted his head. "Are you still going to be a janitor?" Daniel turned around. "No, I'm going to be something different now." Lucas grinned. "Cool." Daniel dropped Lucas off at school and took the train back into Manhattan. The morning rush was in full swing. Commuters pressed against each other, everyone in their own world, headphones and eyes down. Daniel stood near the door and watched the city pass by outside the window. He got off at 42nd Street and walked the rest of the way to Harrington Tower. The lobby felt different in daylight, busier, louder. People in suits rushed past, clutching coffee and briefcases. Daniel took the main elevator this time, not the service entrance. He pressed the button for the 40th floor and watched the numbers climb. The elevator doors opened onto a hallway he had never seen before. Clean white walls, glass offices. A receptionist looked up from her desk and smiled. "Can I help you?" Daniel cleared his throat. "I'm Daniel Martinez. I'm supposed to meet with Mrs. Harrington." The receptionist checked her computer. "Of course, she's expecting you. Follow me." She led him down the hallway to a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows. The view stretched across Manhattan, the same view he had seen from the 45th floor, but somehow different now. The receptionist knocked once and opened the door. Victoria was inside, standing by the window, her phone to her ear. She waved Daniel in and ended her call. "Mr. Martinez," she said. Right on time. Daniel stepped into the office. It was large and expensively furnished with a desk that looked like it cost more than his annual salary used to. Victoria gestured to a chair. Daniel sat. She sat across from him, her expression unreadable. "I'm going to be direct," Victoria said. "The board approved your position. You'll be reporting directly to Sarah Bennett. Your office is down the hall. We're assembling a team for you people who specialize in international contracts and legal translation. You'll have full authority to review any foreign language agreements before they go to the executive level." Daniel nodded. "Understood." Victoria leaned back in her chair. "I also want to apologize. What I said in that meeting was uncalled for. You deserved better." Daniel met her eyes. "You didn't know." Victoria shook her head. "That's not an excuse. I made assumptions. I was wrong." The silence that followed was brief but heavy. Victoria stood and walked to the window. "We pulled out of the Schneider deal, officially. They threatened to sue, but our legal team made it clear we have grounds for a fraud claim. They backed down." Daniel felt something loosen in his chest. "Good." Victoria turned to face him. "You saved this company, Mr. Martinez, and I won't forget that." Daniel stood up. "I just did what needed to be done." Victoria held out her hand again. Daniel shook it. This time, it felt less like a transaction and more like a partnership. She walked him to the door and pointed down the hall. "Your office is the third door on the left. Sarah's waiting to show you around." Daniel walked down the hallway. The third door on the left had a nameplate next to it. Daniel Martinez, Director of International Contracts and Translations. He stood there for a moment staring at the letters. Then he opened the door. The office was smaller than Victoria's, but still larger than any space he had ever worked in. A desk, a bookshelf, a window with a view of the street below. Sarah was inside setting up a laptop. She looked up when he entered and smiled. "Welcome to the team," she said. Daniel stepped inside and closed the door behind him. For the first time in 3 years, he felt like he could breathe. 6 months later, Daniel sat in his office reviewing a contract from a manufacturing firm in South Korea. His team had flagged a clause about tariffs that didn't match the current trade regulations. He sent them a note to revise it and leaned back in his chair. The city stretched out below him, endless and indifferent. His phone buzzed. A text from Lucas's school. Parent-teacher conference next Thursday. Daniel added it to his calendar. There was a knock on his door. Victoria stepped inside holding a folder. "Do you have a minute?" Daniel gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Of course." Victoria sat down and slid the folder across the desk. "New acquisition target, French pharmaceutical company. The preliminary contracts just came in. I wanted your eyes on them before we proceed." Daniel opened the folder and scanned the first page. "I'll have a full analysis by tomorrow." Victoria nodded. Then she looked at him, her expression softer than it used to be. "How's Lucas?" Daniel smiled. "Good. His asthma's under control. New insurance has been a game changer." Victoria stood up. "I'm glad to hear it." She walked to the door, then stopped and turned back. "You know I've been thinking about that night. What you said, about being invisible." Daniel looked up. Victoria met his eyes. "You were right. I didn't see you. None of us did. I'm trying to do better." She left before Daniel could respond. He sat there for a moment staring at the folder in front of him. Then he picked up his phone and called Lucas. "Hey, buddy," Daniel said when his son answered. "How was school?" Lucas's voice was bright and happy. "Good. We're learning about careers. I told my class my dad works in a big office and helps people." Daniel smiled. "That's right." Lucas was quiet for a second. "Dad, is it true you used to be a janitor?" Daniel leaned back in his chair and looked out the window. "I still am, buddy. Just a different kind of cleaning now. I clean up bad contracts." Lucas laughed. "That's so cool." Daniel's chest tightened. Not from sadness, but from something warmer. Pride, maybe. Or relief. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It is?" He hung up and turned back to the contract on his desk. Outside, the city hummed. Inside, Daniel got back to work.